Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Downfield Read podcast. Talking about fantasy football again this morning, this weekend. And what we have this weekend is week 16 in the NFL. So basically, what that means is if your fantasy playoffs have not started at this point, you are just getting into them right now in week 16. First game of the week was Thursday night. We had the Chargers and the Broncos, two really good teams. If you had Bo Nix, I think that was probably the better of the quarterback plays for the week. Running back wise, wasn't so great. But here's where we're at. We've got week 16, and your playoffs, you're either getting ready to get into the championship round or you're done for the year. So we're going to go ahead and do the same thing that we have been. This is going to be the playoff edition, obviously. We have a lot of start advice, sit advice, some sleepers that you can still get after. I know this morning in one of my leagues that I'm still playing in, I was able to scoop up this morning. I found out the New Orleans Saints defense, not going to use them this week, but if you are planning on winning this week and moving on to the championship round, you might want to take a look at what that matchup looks like for the New Orleans Saints defense. If you have a defense right now that is not doing real well or has some bad matchups here in the playoff rounds. So it is about 10:35 here my time. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to run through this: quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends. We'll hopefully get done before noon because obviously today we have two very important games going on. We have the Kansas City Chiefs the Houston Texans at the Kansas City Chiefs. That should be a good game. If Mahomes is going to play, it sounds like he is fine. They are 13-1, and they are trying to hold off the Buffalo Bills to try to get that number one spot. Houston pretty much already has their division clinched up. They will most likely have the number 4 seed in the playoffs. And then the 3:30 game today, Central Time, we've got Pittsburgh at Baltimore. So we've got some great playoff teams, and these could be some playoff preview games, especially for Pittsburgh and Baltimore as well, depending on who wins that division. The other one will probably get the number 5 seed, which means one of them is probably going to end up playing Houston in the first round of the playoffs. So very exciting football for today before we get into tomorrow and Christmas and all that fun stuff. Happy holidays for everyone. And let's go ahead and let's get started with quarterbacks for this week. So your must-sit quarterbacks, and these are guys that are already ranked in the top 12-ish. It's not like you're not going to start them, but they're going to give you the best chance of getting the most points. And my first one overall is Baker Mayfield. I think he's the must start of the week right now at Dallas, who actually gives up the 7th or has given up the 7th most yards and the 3rd most points so far this season. Baker had a clutch game last week where he put up 28 points. He's put up 18 or more points, fantasy points, in 3 of the last 4 outings. And the Bucs are first currently in the NFC South at a record of 8-6, but they've got the Falcons right on their heels at 7-7. So this is going to be kind of a must-win game for them. I think the Bucs actually lose the tiebreaker. Not 100% on that, but they've got to stay one game ahead of Atlanta. I don't think that there's much of a chance, unless they're winning out, that they are going to get a wild card spot, especially with how well Minnesota, Green Bay, a couple other teams are playing. Washington, you've got who knows who's going to win in the NFC West, if that's going to start to get to be a race down the line. But Tampa Bay is going to have to win in order to keep this number 1 spot. So I like Baker Mayfield. I think he's going to go off again today. I think that's a must start for you. Number 2 is going to be Kyler Murray. And Kyler Murray is currently sitting 10th overall. Again, depending on what kind of a format that you're playing in, 10th overall for quarterbacks in fantasy. He's playing at Carolina. And this has kind of been a trend all year, right? Because Carolina has given up the most amount of points this year. It's just a smart play, especially if you've got somebody in the top 12. Kyler Murray, Arizona, like I just mentioned, 7-7. They're 1 game back from both the Rams and the Seahawks, so they are playing for their playoff lives here. Desperately need a win this week, so I could see Kyler Murray stepping on the gas, not letting go of that, just trying to get a win, trying to stay competitive in that division where, who knows, they might win that division in the last 3 weeks of the season here. But Arizona got a great matchup against Carolina. I would definitely depend on Kyler Murray to get you some big points today. And then, believe it or not, and this guy's been getting a lot of flack, but he's got a good matchup for this week, and he's been playing relatively well. I really like Aaron Rodgers this week. 13th overall for fantasy quarterback. So he does not fall within that top 12. He's just outside. Like I mentioned before, if you've got somebody like Lamar Jackson, you're going to start him. If you've got somebody like Josh Allen, you're going to end up starting him. Aaron Rodgers, I think, is a must start, especially if you're looking for somebody. Maybe you've got a bad matchup in there if you're looking for somebody to pick up real quick, or you've got a decision between a couple other guys. Aaron Rodgers, 13th versus the Rams, who have given up the 8th most yards, total yards this year, and the 9th most points allowed this year. So arguably a good matchup. Rodgers and the Jets, they're out of the playoffs, but it seems like Rodgers is out to kind of boost his own stats, his own numbers, to make himself look good, as he's already got one foot out the door for the Jets. He's maybe, it's weird to say auditioning to play for another team at this point, but Aaron Rodgers doesn't sound like he wants to go back to play for the Jets. And he's put up 14 or more fantasy points in his last 4 games, with 30 points coming last week versus Jacksonville. And if you had Devontae Adams, you saw the numbers that he put up, almost 40 points last week. So it looks like him and Devontae are trying to end the season on a good note, maybe kind of give that last little birdie as they flip off the Jets organization and walk out the door. Wouldn't surprise me. But those are my 3 must-start individuals for quarterbacks this week. I think they're going to have all really good games. Moving on from the must-start quarterbacks to the must-sit quarterbacks. The first one here, you might call me a little bit foolish, but Jayden Daniels. We talked about you're not going to sit some of these quarterbacks like Josh Allen, like a Lamar Jackson, the guys that are putting up a lot of points. Jayden Daniels is actually 6th overall, again, depending on what format that you're playing in fantasy football. So Daniels is 6th. However, he's going up against Philadelphia. And Philly has given up the fewest total yards this year, the fewest passing yards, the fewest points this season. They are going up against arguably the best defense in the NFL. Plus, the last time that Daniels faced Philly, Washington lost that game 26-18. That was about 5 weeks ago. I don't see anything changing there. I still don't think that they're a good enough team to beat the Eagles. The Eagles are really coming on strong now at the end of the year. But Jayden Daniels at number 6, and this is one of these guys where I was just talking about Aaron Rodgers. Maybe you've got both of these guys on your bench. Daniels is 6th and Rodgers is 13th. You might want to plug in Rodgers instead of Daniels at this point. My second must-sit quarterback is actually playing today. He is just right above Aaron Rodgers. He's 12th overall. Versus Houston is Pat Mahomes, and Houston has given up the 4th fewest yards this year. They've given up the 6th fewest passing yards this year. They've given up the 9th fewest points so far this year. So they have a stellar defense as well. Not as good as last year, and it seems like they're kind of flying under the radar a little bit. Houston not in the limelight all that much this year as they were last year when C.J. Stroud was a rookie, but their defense is still holding strong. They still have a very formidable defense, and Kansas City is not known for their offensive output there. So Mahomes has averaged 15 points over the last 3 weeks, but that was against Las Vegas. It was against Cleveland. They had the Chargers in there as well. But had some arguably better matchups than I guess what shows his talent or his skill. Plus, he's got that bum ankle. Who knows if he's going to stay in the whole game? I would stay away from Pat Mahomes at this point. My third must-sit of this weekend is going to be Tua. He's going up against San Fran, who's given up the 3rd fewest total yards, the 2nd fewest passing yards this year. Miami has a 5% chance of making the playoffs. Their season is pretty much over at this point. They need like 5 other teams to lose, and they need to win out and all that other fun stuff. So Tua only put up 4 fantasy points last week. So if you did start him last week and you're amazingly still in the playoffs, I would stick a fork in him and the Dolphins altogether. They are done. As far as sleepers, guys that you can replace these 3 with if you don't have an Aaron Rodgers available for you, I do like these guys are outside and far outside of the top 12, so they actually should be available in most leagues as well. You've got Russell Wilson. He's the 28th ranked best quarterback out there at Baltimore, who's given up the 2nd most passing yards and the 11th most points this year. So it's not necessarily a bad play to go out and get Russell Wilson at this point. Last time he faced Baltimore, which was 5 weeks ago, he only put up about 6.5 fantasy points, but since then he's averaged 16 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. So Russell Wilson coming around. I know George Pickens is out for this week. He's gonna have a hard time trying to find the right target to get to, especially with what that Ravens defense has been over the last 5 or 6 weeks as well. They've really turned it around since the first half of the season, but they're banged up on the defensive side of the ball as well. I would look for Russell Wilson to have a sneaky good week this week. Second sleeper is going to be Cooper Rush for Dallas, and he's actually ranked 35th for fantasy football quarterbacks. And the reason is because they're going against Tampa Bay. And Tampa Bay has given up the third most passing yards and the sixth most total yards so far this year. So that's a very comfortable matchup with Cooper Rush at this point. Dallas has nothing to play for this year. Cooper is going to be trying to prove that he's an actual starter in the NFL or at least a viable backup in the NFL. So he does have something to play for. Plus, Cooper put up 19 fantasy points last week. And he hasn't put up under 11.5, 11.8 in the last 5 weeks. Or in the last 5 games, I should say. So Cooper Rush is a very viable candidate to be starting, especially if you lost somebody, if you're not comfortable with Patrick Mahomes or Jaden Daniels at this point. My third sleeper outside of the top 12, Mac Jones, and he's 40th for fantasy quarterbacks at this point in time. He's playing at Las Vegas. They give up the 6th most points, or they've given up the 6th most points this season. Jones is showing that he belongs somewhere in the NFL as well. He put up 18.5 fantasy points the last 2 out of the last 3 weeks. He's done that. So Mac Jones, viable option there. He likes to throw it around. He's not going to, the Jaguars don't have anything to play for. He's just going out there trying to sling it around, make himself look good. So I do like Mac Jones in a very deep league, or if you're really desperate for another quarterback. I like those 3 as sleepers. So here we've got our first question. We've got 12-man PPR, 2 flex, wide receiver, running back, tight end, starters, Kyler, Henry, Dowdle, CD, Nico, McBride, T. Higgins, Devonta Smith. Bench, Jonnu Smith, Brian Robinson Jr., Waddell, McMillan, Spears. Yeah, no, I think that's right on the head. And I'm actually going to mention a lot of these guys throughout the show as well. Starters, Kyler Murray, absolutely. As I mentioned before, he's one of my top 3 guys. You're never going to sit Derrick Henry. I think Dowdle has a very favorable matchup against Tampa Bay as well. That defense is not very stout. I think Dallas is going to be putting up some points. CeeDee Lamb, I've got CD again. I just mentioned Cooper Rush in there. He's been putting up some big points. His main guy has been CD, so you have to stick with him. And like I said, some of these other guys that you mentioned, I don't want to give it all away right now, but I think that's about right. Jonnu Smith, Brian Robinson, keep listening. We're about to get into the running backs here, but I think B-Rob Jr. is one of my must-sits for the week. Waddle, he might be a decent play just because Tyreek Hill is questionable at this point, or the last time I checked. McMillan is a good pickup. He's been doing really well over the last 2 weeks. He's had some big games. And I would say if you're playing this week and you've picked up McMillan, definitely keep him on your bench. Obviously, you've got better wide receivers at this point, but if he has 3 great weeks in a row where he's putting up 15-plus points, and maybe even in a full PPR, it's been closer to 20. I know in a half PPR, he's been putting up about 15. And then Najee Spears. So, yeah, that's great. Devonta or Jonnu or B-Rob Jr. in the second flex. I like Devonta Smith. Jonnu is a good play. I just don't think that they're going to do a whole lot. I think it's going to be a tough week for them against San Francisco. San Fran has a lot to play for, and they generally don't give up a lot of passing yards to tight ends. So I don't like the Jonnu play there. But again, that Philadelphia game against Washington, Philly's going to go in there and try to prove a point. So I do like the Devonta Smith. A.J. Brown and him have been sharing a lot of the passing or the receptions. So if I'm picking one guy out of there, I'm going Devonta over Jonnu and B-Rob. So great questions, though. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Let's continue on with the running backs. And the guys, and how I break this up, if this is the first time that you've listened, I break up my running backs like an RB1 and an RB2. So the RB1s are guys that are already ranked within the top 12. The RB2s are ranked between 13 and 24. My favorite this week, for obvious reasons we'll get into, is Jahmyr Gibbs. He is actually number 3 right now, and I can't believe that he's number 3 for fantasy running backs. If you're thinking about it, yep, it's Saquon Barkley and it's Derrick Henry, right? But Jahmyr Gibbs, is he even really the true number 1 running back? I mean, I know that he splits time with David Montgomery, but David Montgomery usually comes out first. He gets the majority of the carries in the first quarter, and then it's kind of a mix between him and Jahmyr. Well, so it's stunning actually to see Jahmyr Gibbs as he's splitting time with Montgomery as the number 3 overall running back in fantasy. But he is, and they're at Chicago, who's given up the 7th most rushing yards this year and the 9th most total yards this year. Gibbs has put up 16.5 points or more, including a 26-point performance last week in 4 of the last 5 weeks. And like I said, Montgomery's out. He's done for the rest of the season. So Detroit, who does have a lot to play for yet, they're still playing for that number 1 seed. They've got a tiebreaker right now over Philly, but you're going to want to play this one hard. And throughout the season, what we've seen from Detroit is that they're putting up 40 points, 50 points. They don't care. They're up by 30 points at halftime. They're still throwing the ball around, and everybody is going to get some. Jamo Williams and St. Brown and everybody else. So Jahmyr Gibbs being the core running back now, he's going to be getting a lot of looks in that offense. So I love Jahmyr Gibbs. Right behind him is Josh Jacobs, and Josh Jacobs is actually ranked the 4th best running back in fantasy football this year versus New Orleans this week, who's given up the 3rd most yards and the 6th most rushing yards this season. And honestly, who else knew that Josh Jacobs was number 4? I might have mentioned it at the beginning of the year because 2 years ago in 2022 season, he was the leading rusher in the NFL, and that was with Las Vegas. So, sure, he didn't have a great year last year with Las Vegas. That whole team kind of fell apart. He goes to Green Bay. It's a great fit. They had Aaron Jones there. They replaced him with Josh Jacobs. He was one of the guys that a lot of people were sleeping on in the beginning of the year. And I'm pretty sure that I told you not to because the guy was, the rushing leader 2 years prior. It's not very typical that you get one back-to-back, and CMC is further proof of that. He's definitely nowhere near being that number 1 guy. Generally, it's because of injuries. Sometimes it's like Josh Jacobs where the offense just falls apart and they're trying out different quarterbacks and they got new receivers and all that kind of stuff. So Josh Jacobs, he's put up 19.5 fantasy points or more since coming off of the bye week in week 10. That's 5 weeks in a row of 19.5 fantasy points or more. So this guy is on fire, and that's why he's the 4th ranked running back right now overall in fantasy. So I expect him to have a big game against New Orleans. That offense for New Orleans should see a lot of 3 and outs, giving the ball to Green Bay. They should get out to a comfortable lead. Use Josh Jacobs a lot. He should score at least 1 touchdown. I almost want to say at least 2 touchdowns. He should be getting in the end zone quite a bit. So another big day expected for Josh Jacobs. Number 3, as far as my must-start running backs in the top 12, Bijan Robinson, who's number 5 overall. And I guess he answered that question when everybody was talking about it in the beginning of the fantasy football season. Who do you take after CMC? Is it going to be Breece Hall? Is it going to be Bijan Robinson? I actually went with Bijan Robinson over Breece Hall with my 5th overall pick in one of my leagues, and it turned out to be a winner there. So he is 5th overall for running backs this year, and he is going up against the New York Giants, who have given up the 2nd most rushing yards per year or so far this year. So it's a great matchup overall. Doesn't really matter what quarterback that they're going to start in there, if it's Kirk Cousins or if it's Michael Penix. It's actually probably more beneficial if they start Penix. That way they'll probably be getting the ball more to Bijan Robinson. Robinson has been on the decline the last 3 weeks, but is still averaging 18 points per game in that span. Kind of hard to say, right? He's been on the decline, but he's averaging 18. That's crazy. Atlanta is still very much alive in the playoffs. We mentioned that when we talked about Tampa Bay earlier. But a win this week would go a long way to help their playoff situation out. And looking at the RB2s, and these are the guys between 13 and 24, must start. As I just mentioned, Breece Hall. Breece Hall, number 16 overall for running backs this year. Kind of a crappy situation in the New York Jets land, which if you're a New York Jets fan, you were not expecting them to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. I'm sure Breece Hall wasn't either, but he is sitting at 16th best running back overall this year. They're going up against the LA Rams, who have given up the 5th most rushing yards and the 9th most points per game this year. Hall hasn't been great down the stretch here, but Braylon Allen, who his backup is still questionable to play. He might even be out at this point. It's a favorable matchup in the trenches between the Jets and the Rams. I see Breece Hall kind of breaking out of this slump a little bit here. Do not hesitate to put him in as your RB2. Another good RB2 for this week is going to be Bucky Irving. He's sitting right behind Breece Hall at number 17. Again, we talked about Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay's got a lot to play for, going up against Dallas, who's given up the third most points and the fourth most rushing yards this year. Bucky is healthy, and the Bucs need a win. Irving put up 24 and 26 fantasy points in weeks 12 and 13, but then he posted 2.5 and 12.5. Ouch. But he's going to get back on track this week with Dallas. There's no doubt about it. Feel comfortable in starting Bucky in your lineup this week. And then my third and final RB2 is going to be Tony Pollard, and he's sitting at 18th, right behind Breece Hall and Bucky Irving. I like Tony Pollard against Indianapolis, at Indianapolis, so you don't have to worry about any kind of weather affecting his performance. And the Colts have given up the fifth most total yards this year and the third most rushing yards this year. So very favorable matchup with Tony Pollard, especially with the quarterback issues that they have had there. Pollard and the entire Titans offense has been stagnant as of late, but I'm going to go with Pollard in this one to go ahead and get them out of the slump. I would expect a score early from Tony Pollard in this game. My must-sit running backs for this week. First one is going to be Najee Harris. We already talked about Pittsburgh. Going into Baltimore, I don't think that's going to be a very favorable matchup there. Obviously, Baltimore has shut down the run better than anyone else this year. They've given up the fewest yards on the ground. Harris has been on the decline the last 3 weeks, putting up 22, then 11.5, and then 2.5 fantasy points last week versus Philly. So if you started him last week and you still made the playoffs, congratulations. He definitely did not help you out in that situation, and I don't think he's going to help you get out of this round either. So I would keep Najee Harris on your bench, and he's ranked 20th overall for fantasy football running backs. Guy that I just talked about here, and a question that I just answered about Brian Robinson Jr. is my second must-sit candidate for this week. Again, I don't like any Washington Commanders in this game versus Philadelphia. Philadelphia is just playing the hot hand, and not only that, they've been good all year round. Speaking of Philly, who's given up the fewest total yards, the fewest points this season, the only thing that they haven't done is what the Ravens have done, which is give up the fewest rushing yards. B-Rob Jr. hasn't been playing bad, so it's nothing against him personally. He's put up more than 10 points after returning from injury on average. It's just that the Eagles' defense is that good. So Brian Robinson Jr. would probably look for a different running back at that point in time. Third one that I don't like this week is Kenneth Walker versus Minnesota. And the Vikings have given up the second fewest rushing yards and the second fewest points this season. And Walker's also coming off of an injury and hasn't played in the last 2 weeks. So, there is that cliche of shaking the rust off. He's going to have to fill in for Charbonnet now. But I don't like Kenneth Walker not playing for the last couple of weeks and then having to go up against the Minnesota Vikings defense that has really been good at shutting down the run this week. So if you've got a backup option in there, definitely think about those. Otherwise, here are 3 sleeper options for you that I think will do very well. And these guys should, maybe be available. Maybe they're not. Maybe they've been sitting on your bench for a while. Alexander Mattison versus Jacksonville, who we mentioned before. They've given up the most total yards, the 9th most rushing yards, and the 5th most points so far this season. Madison, coming off of an injury, should be readily available for most teams. Maybe he was even dropped by somebody once they started to play Amir Abdullah. It sounds like Madison is going to be the head guy there, getting all of the runs, and you got to like that against Jacksonville. I don't care what kind of running back you got. Who knows? I think they're going to start Desmond Ridder at quarterback, so you don't have a viable quarterback option in there. Hell, even if they were down by 20 points, I still think that they're running the ball quite a bit with Madison at that point. My second sleeper, and this is a guy that's going to be playing a lot more because Nick Chubb got hurt, and that is Jerome Ford going up against Cincinnati, who's given up the 4th most total yards and the 2nd most points this season. Nick Chubb is done for the year. Ford is the guy that should be readily available for people in most leagues. Can't imagine somebody had him unless it was a handcuff situation, but look for Jerome Ford against Cincinnati. That should be a very good, favorable matchup for in that point, even in the flex. Travis Etienne is my third sleeper going up against Las Vegas again. They give up the 6th most points this season. Etienne has carried 14 times or had carried the ball 14 times. He was targeted 5 times last week. I think Etienne is a favorable option this week as well against Las Vegas. Hell, who knows? That game could even be a high-scoring game, seeing as how both of these defenses are very good. But look for Travis Etienne to actually break out. He's been kind of limping through the year. You got Tank Bigsby splitting time with him as well. But Doug Peterson is really kind of just barely grasping on to his job right there. So he's going to have to put together a game plan that gets Jacksonville another win for the season. And as we move along, so there's all of the running backs. Let's move along to the wide receiver situation for this week. And again, we use the same kind of a format as we do with the running backs here, where you've got your wide receiver ones and your wide receiver twos. Obvious no-brainer wide receiver start for this week is going to be Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase is first overall for wide receivers. So kudos to everyone that took him. I know in one league, one guy took him number 1 overall. And everybody was like, oh my God, you're not taking CMC. No, it was a great pick. It was a very smart move. Ja'Marr Chase is first overall for wide receivers going up against Cleveland, who's given up the 7th most points this year. Chase has put up, and get these numbers, 50 points, 23, 17.5, 38, and 14 fantasy points in his last 5 games. So if you think that because Cincinnati is out of the playoffs that they're not going to be putting up some big numbers, I think Joe Burrow is still trying to prove that he should be in that MVP conversation. Ja'Marr Chase will continue to get looks. It's a division game. You got to love that. They're going to go in tough. I think Ja'Marr Chase, again, puts up some big numbers closer to 20-plus points. My number 2 favorite wide receiver this week is Jackson Smith-Njigba. While I said that I did not like Kenneth Walker against Minnesota, it means that they're going to have to throw, right? You got to have the flip side of the coin there. So JSN is 7th overall for wide receivers, and kudos to the Fantasy Couriers. And I think it was DJ Dove who had asked me early on in the season, do I still think that Metcalf is the number 1 or is it going to be JSN? I said Metcalf. Obviously, he's had some injuries in there, but JSN has really took over that role. Expect him to be the number 1 next year for the team as well. He's shown great signs of growth this year versus last season. But going up against the Vikings, who've given up the 4th most passing yards this year, and Njigba hasn't put up less than 10 fantasy points in the last 10 weeks, going up against great passing defenses like San Francisco and the Jets and Arizona and Green Bay. So look for their passing game to be the focal point of their offense going into this week against Minnesota. Seattle also needs a win big time in order to stay in this playoff chase. As I mentioned before, the NFC West, you don't know who it's going to be, and all 4 of those teams are still in with 3 weeks left to play. So everybody should be giving it their all, going for it on 4th down, getting those extra yards. That should be great. My second wide receiver number 1, my third wide receiver 1 for this weekend is Malik Nabers. And I know that sounds crazy. He is actually 12th overall for wide receivers. They're going up against Atlanta, who's given up the 8th most passing yards this year and the 9th most points allowed. No doubt the Falcons will get out to a lead and the Giants will be passing to play catch up. So that's where Malik Nabers is going to get plenty of looks in this game. So we've got another question coming in, though, before we get into the wide receiver number 2s. Hey, Jeff, half PPR, flex, London or Walker? To me, it's a coin flip. I just mentioned I do not like Walker this week at all. He's one of my 3 must-sit. Kenneth Walker, I don't like him against Minnesota. Just kind of went into they're going to have to get into the passing game a little bit. Minnesota shut down running defenses. He's coming off of an injury the last couple of weeks, hasn't played. I just don't like that kind of a situation. But that's me. I've said this all year round. I'm kind of a wait-and-see guy. When somebody comes off of an injury, they're usually trying to kind of phase him in a little bit. So I don't necessarily think that he is going to get the bulk of the carries. And even if he does, Minnesota's got a great offense. I mean, we've seen that week after week. Minnesota could get out to a big lead, and that completely takes away Walker. I do like London against the New York Giants. The Giants obviously have nothing to play for. I like London for a score, and maybe he gets 65, 75 yards. But yeah, in half PPR, I would definitely flex London instead of Walker. Yep. You are welcome, Mark. Thank you for the question. Let's get into the wide receiver 2s. Wide receiver 2s. My favorite wide receiver 2 for the week is Mike Evans, and he is actually 15th only because he was out for a while, obviously with that injury. Going up against Dallas, who's given up the 7th most yards and the 3rd most points this season. Evans has put up roughly 70 fantasy points in his last 4 games since returning from injury. So you can feel comfortable. I already talked about Baker Mayfield. Tampa Bay need a win. Going to go against Dallas. They're going to have to put up some points. I love that connection. They're so good together, Baker Mayfield and Mike Evans. Without Chris Godwin in there, obviously, because he's on IR, done for the year, your main guy is going to be Mike Evans. Obviously, they're going to get to McMillan a little bit here, and Cade Otton, he's going to get his catches as well. But do love Mike Evans, and he blew up earlier this month. So Jayden Reed is my favorite, my second favorite wide receiver, number 2. Jayden Reed might not be yours after the game that he had a couple of weeks ago, but he is actually 16th in fantasy, right behind Mike Evans. Going up against New Orleans, who has given up the 3rd most total yards and the 5th most passing yards so far this year. Reed has been relatively silent the last couple of weeks, including a goose egg 2 weeks ago, but Green Bay will need him back if they expect to make a solid playoff run. So obviously everybody has seen what's happened to Jayden Reed. I don't think anybody is happy with it, including Jayden Reed himself. They're going to get him more involved with that offense, and they're going to need to against the Rams, against New Orleans, who could potentially put up a lot of points this week as well. My third favorite wide receiver, too, is we talked about his quarterback not too long ago as one of my favorite quarterback starts for this week, Davante Adams. And Davante Adams is currently number 14th overall for wide receivers going against the Rams. This is where the Rams come in. The Rams have given up the 8th most total yards and the 9th most points so far this year. Adams has put up 15, 21.5, and 38 points in his last 3 games. So again, between Davante Adams and Rodgers, whether they're just padding the stats, if they're just playing catch out there, obviously Adams is Rodgers' favorite wide receiver, so he's going to chuck it to him a bunch. Sorry if you've got Garrett Wilson. But Davante seems to be the main guy out there. They're padding stats because they got nothing else to do. They're not playing for anything except for pride at this point. The Rams are going to put up a lot of points, and I'm going to guess that they're going to try to keep up with them. So look for Davante Adams to have a big week as well. Here are some must-sits, 3 of them actually. We talked about this guy before a little bit. My first must-sit is Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, 21st overall, and I don't know if his status has actually changed. So I want to check that out. He was questionable as of last night. Did not check on him this morning. Looks like he's still listed as questionable to play, so keep your eye on that one. But I wouldn't go with him anyway, to be quite honest with you. Going up against San Francisco, they've given up the 3rd fewest total points this year, the 2nd fewest passing yards. It's not a favorable situation. Tua last week, I think he only put up like 3.5 points or something. The offense does not run through Tyreek Hill. The offense runs through A-Chain, and I think that that's what's going to have to happen in order for them to beat San Francisco as well. So with Hill being questionable, bad wrist, he's got some personal issues going on. I wouldn't trust his status for this week against San Fran. Number 2, and this is going to be tough because I had Terry McLaurin, so I understand the problems that can be had with Terry McLaurin. He can put up 25 points or he can put up 2 points. But I'm going to say Terry McLaurin, who is the 5th overall wide receiver ranked in fantasy football this year against Philly. I believe that I called this a while ago for Terry McLaurin to sit him during 1 game or 2 games. It's really hot and cold with him. And the Eagles have given up the fewest total yards, the fewest passing yards, the fewest points. McLaurin only put up 1.5 fantasy points against Philly 5 weeks ago. So it's not a great matchup. They shut down wide receivers, even great wide receivers. The big difference in this game when you're looking at it is that Philadelphia actually has a solid quarterback or a more solid quarterback in Jalen Hurts, and Jaden Daniels is a rookie. So big high pressure game. Washington has an outside chance, I would say outside chance to make the playoffs looking at their last couple of games here in the season. I think they don't make it overall, and I think it's because they can't get the ball to Terry McLaurin, so I would definitely sit him. And my third must sit, and this is going to be multiple must sits, basically any Colts wide receiver versus Tennessee, who has given up the 2nd fewest total yards, the 3rd least passing yards this year. Anthony Richardson is a terrible passer. I don't think you can trust any wide receiver, unless you're looking for 5 catches and 50 yards, if that gets you by maybe in a flex type of a situation, I don't think you can trust any Colts wide receiver at this point, especially against Tennessee. Colts are not going to make the playoffs. They're very outside and maybe 1% chance to actually make it. Forget it. Stick a fork in them. They are done as well. So in place of these guys, if you have some of these wide receivers that I just basically bashed and said, hey, don't start them, who can you start, or who are going to be some sleepers? And these are some guys that are outside of the top 24 that you can go ahead and feel comfortable in starting. And my first one is Khalil Shakir. He is currently number 26th overall for fantasy football wide receivers, going up against New England this week, who isn't necessarily bad on defense. They're giving up the 10th most points. They're giving up the 11th most total yards. So it's not terrible, but Shakir has silently been putting up decent numbers the last few weeks. Just go ahead and ask Amari Cooper owners, guys that have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper's disappeared a little bit, and Shakir has taken over. Shakir's posted 11 plus fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 weeks, including 2 weeks ago when he had 19. So I would feel very comfortable in starting Khalil Shakir this week against New England. My second sleeper, Marvin Harrison Jr. He's also not been great as of late. He's 28th overall for fantasy football wide receivers, going up against Carolina, who has given up the 2nd most total yards and the most points this year. MHJ hasn't been great 3 out of the last 4 weeks. He's only posted 6, had a good game with 14.5, and then 7, and then 4 fantasy points each one of the last 4 weeks. Seeing as how Arizona still has a shot at the division title and making the playoffs, I would expect him to get back on track here the last 2 weeks of the fantasy football playoff season. You can look like a genius for drafting him, for sticking with him, for trading for him, maybe when he was having some off time. But this week against that Carolina defense, I expect him to put up some big numbers. And my third sleeper for the week, Jakobi Meyers, 29th overall. And that's actually kind of shocking to think about too, that any Las Vegas wide receiver at this point would be in the top 30, but he is 29th overall, going up against Jacksonville this week, who's given up the most total yards, the most passing yards, and the 5th most points on the season. 3 out of the last 4 weeks, Meyers has posted 10 plus fantasy points. He's averaging 12 points in that same time frame. So if you're looking for a reliable flex option, or if one of your wide receivers was Tyreek Hill and he might not be playing, I would actually rather put in Jakobi Meyers at this point. I don't care if Desmond Ridder is throwing to him. They're going up against Jacksonville. Might be an ugly game. He could get an ugly touchdown out of there somewhere. But I would expect Antonio Pierce to pull out all the shots and try to make this look like a successful season so that he can keep his job. Right. Okay, let's get into the tight ends. Let me check. Nope, no questions as of this point. So let's get into tight ends real quick. Must start tight ends. And this is probably one of the easier categories that I went through preparing for the show today. Brock Bowers, number 1. Just talked about Las Vegas. I think Las Vegas is going to be running the ball a lot. I like Alexander Mattison a little bit. But Jacksonville, again, who gives up the 8th most yards to tight ends and the 5th most points overall. That's a great matchup for Brock Bowers. Everyone should have a score for Las Vegas this week. Let's just put it on the board right now. Second is Trey McBride. Trey McBride is 3rd overall for tight ends in fantasy football, again, going up against Carolina, who gives up the 2nd most yards to tight ends and has given up the most points. So how could that equation fail? McBride has scored almost 60 fantasy points in the last 4 weeks, so they are utilizing him a ton more in Arizona. Look for him to have a big week as well. And David Njoku, if he plays, saw him, believe that he was still listed as questionable. We can take a look at that real quick because I want to know as well. My opponent actually has him on his bench. Njoku is still listed as questionable with that hamstring injury. He might be a game time decision, but I like David Njoku. He's 12th overall for fantasy tight ends, even for the lack that he's played. If he plays at Cincinnati, they gave up the most yards to tight ends in the NFL this year. They also gave up the 6th most passing yards in general and the 2nd most points this season. So I would expect DTR to actually go toward David Njoku just as a check down, dump off type of guy. So look for him to have a good game if he plays. My must-sit tight ends, I'm going to start off with Cole Kmet, and Cole Kmet is number 17 overall for tight ends, going up against Detroit, who gives up the fewest yards to tight ends this year. Cole Kmet hasn't put up more than 4 points in the last 3 weeks. So this guy's cooled off. You can look at his quarterback for that. Hangs onto the ball too much. Can't find open wide receivers. Not very good. Cole Kmet not going to have a good day versus Detroit. Number 2, Kyle Pitts is a must-sit for me. I don't like Kyle Pitts. He's 14th overall for tight ends. Going up against the Giants, who have given up the 3rd fewest yards to tight ends this year, and the 7th fewest passing yards total overall this season. Don't like him against the Giants, especially if they're going to be starting Michael Penix in there. I do like Drake London. I mentioned him before, a couple of long shots. Maybe London gets open. I think that's what Penix is going to look for, not these dinky-dunky Kyle Pitts type of situations. And then my 3rd must-sit is Zach Ertz. And Zach Ertz, again, here's another guy from Washington. I don't like anybody on Washington this week. I think it's going to be a real crap show for the Commanders. Zach Ertz is 9th overall. If you've got another option, try to find him. If he plays, because I believe that he was questionable as well versus Philly, they give up the 6th fewest yards to tight ends, and basically they shut everybody down. So last week, Ertz only put up 3.5 points. Not a very good matchup for you if you were hoping to get into the playoffs or you had your first round of the playoffs. Either way, I wouldn't go with Zach Ertz this week either. Here's some good sleepers for you, though. If you've got one of these 3 guys and you're unsure about it, or you've got Njoku and he's going to be out, here's a couple of good guys for you. How about Mike Gesicki? 18th overall in fantasy tight ends versus Cleveland, who gives up the 7th most yards to tight ends. Plus, Cincinnati isn't going to need to go downfield a whole lot, while I do like Jamar Chase in this game because Burrow doesn't care. As I mentioned before, I think he's going to go long shot to stay in that MVP conversation. They're not going to have to do that a whole lot. They'll have plenty of time of possession with DTR at quarterback, as I mentioned before. So look for Gesicki to get his share of the targets out of this offense this week. My number 2 sleeper is Dalton Kincaid. He's 22nd overall for fantasy tight ends, going up against New England. Kincaid hasn't made the impact that fantasy owners would have liked, but Buffalo will be in the same position as Cincinnati going up against Cleveland. No need to throw deep. Looking for your checkdowns. I think Dalton Kincaid has a little bit better game than what he has had so far this year. And then sticking with the Daltons, I'm going to double down on Daltons. Dalton Schultz, who's 23rd, right behind Dalton Kincaid at Kansas City, who gives up the 5th most yards to tight ends this year. Plus, he'll be on my bench this week, so I know that he's going to put up a crap ton of points because I'm starting Tucker Kraft in place of Dalton Schultz this week. Another guy that you could probably pick up, and I will say this, I am going up against a guy whose both tight ends are questionable, and one of them is David Njoku, and the other one was Cade Otton, who is now been downgraded to doubtful to play. So that's good for me. I picked up one of the only good tight ends that were available. Look for Brenton Strange. He's got a good matchup as well with in Jacksonville going up against Las Vegas. So here's another little nugget of tight end information for you. Brenton Strange going up against Las Vegas. They give up the 4th most yards to tight ends overall. Strange put up 12.8 points and a half PPR last week against a Jets defense who's usually been very good against tight ends. Las Vegas should be a cakewalk for him. So definitely look for Brenton Strange. I guess he'll be classified as my super sleeper. And I snagged him in that league because I did not want my opponent to get another tight end who now, unfortunately, he's gone with Foster Moreau from the New Orleans Saints. He's got a decent matchup. Green Bay gives up the 9th most yards to tight ends, but Foster Moreau actually put up 12 points last week against Washington. So we'll see how that whole scenario plays out if it works out in my favor. Going on to defenses, must-start defenses. I've said this. Here's kind of the theme of the day, I guess. The Philadelphia defense against the Washington Commanders. The Eagles have the 8th-ranked fantasy defense in the league, or in fantasy, I should say, depending on, again, what you're getting points based off of. This game has playoff implications, and it's between division rivals. So the difference is, like I mentioned before, Philly has a veteran quarterback. Washington does not. I don't think Jaden Daniels rises to the occasion, which is fine. He's a rookie this year. He's playing very well. Nothing wrong with him. I just think that the Philly defense is just way better, especially in the trenches. They've got great cornerbacks. It's ridiculous how good that defense is. So stick with them. I think they're going to put up some big points this week. My second favorite defense is the Buffalo Bills. They're ninth ranked overall this year in fantasy. Going up against New England simply because New England is the worst team in the NFL. Look at some power rankings. I'm not just saying it to be mean. They do have one of the worst offenses in the NFL. The Bills are trying to get that number one spot from KC, so I think they're going to step on the neck of the Patriots here. Hope that, Houston takes out Kansas City this week. Maybe they can get one game closer. You never know. Third favorite defense this week is the Detroit Lions. They are 10th overall in fantasy so far this year, going up against Chicago because Caleb Williams is terrible. So we're throwing another rookie quarterback into the situation here. Actually, the third one. Wow, I didn't even realize that. All three of those defenses have rookie quarterbacks playing for them. Hell, might as well go that route, I guess. Caleb Williams is terrible. He holds on to the ball too long. We've already talked about him. The Lions are going to put everything that they have into each game remaining, which is a lot because they're going to have to keep up with the Philadelphia Eagles or stay on top of the Philadelphia Eagles to get that number one seed. And they're also kind of playing against Minnesota at this point too. So they got to win the division yet, and then they got to get the number one seed. So look for Detroit to keep on chugging along with Dan Campbell. He's going to do everything that he can to make sure that they win and that they are aggressive. Must sit defenses this week. The Bears. We just talked about the Bears versus Detroit. They're the highest scoring offense in the NFL. Don't play the Bears this week as your defense. Just don't do it. Not a smart play. Mentioned Seattle before as well. They're seventh actually in fantasy football versus Minnesota, who scored the eighth most points this season. I mentioned it before. I think that I believe that this is going to be a shootout. Minnesota's been playing really hot on offense lately. They got Aaron Jones, who's doing really well. Justin Jefferson, Addison's coming around, TJ Hawkinson. So that whole offense is really, really powerful. I would not be surprised if this game, because they've got a lot of weapons on the other side as well, turns out to be one of the higher scoring games this week. But definitely do not start Seattle this week. I would keep them on the bench. And the one that might be the most surprising, it really shouldn't be though, the Steelers defense. Yes, they are third in fantasy football, right behind the Broncos and the Vikings, but they're playing Baltimore. Granted, the Ravens seem to be lacking at wide receiver this week. I have no idea what they're going to be doing there. They just let go of Deontay Johnson. Bateman is questionable. It's kind of a mess. They brought somebody back up from there. I don't even know what his name is, from the practice squad. I don't know. They should still pull up a lot of numbers with Lamar. I think they might go to a more of a heavy running offense. Justice Hill out of the background can catch a 50-yarder. Lamar can always take off. So I don't like the Steelers defense as a prime defense for this week. If you're looking for sleepers, if you've got one of these must-sit defenses, here's some sleeper opportunities for you. I do like the Colts defense against Tennessee. The Colts are 18th overall. Tennessee Titans don't score a lot, and they give up a ton of sacks. There was one game where I started, and probably the only game that I started, Will Levis, and he got sacked like 9 times. So, I mean, just off of that alone, it's like, man, yeah, you could start the Colts for some good turnovers probably as well. There's probably going to be an interception or two, maybe a fumble recovery or two. Colts have a good opportunity to put up some big points. The defense does fantasy-wise against Tennessee. Tampa Bay Bucks is my second sleeper of the week. They are 16th overall in fantasy football versus Dallas. They still have Cooper Rush at quarterback. CeeDee Lamb was injured earlier this week. The O-line is kind of broken down for the Dallas Cowboys. Tampa Bay is going to have to step up. I like them as a sleeper option against Dallas and shutting down Rico Dowdle. And then number 3, the Arizona Cardinals, who are 17th. So all 3 of those sleeper teams are kind of bunched all together. 17th overall at Carolina, who has scored the 5th fewest points so far this season. And as I mentioned before, Arizona desperately needs a win. They're going to have to put everything that they have into it in order to continue to win and try to make a playoff appearance and a playoff run. I think that's about all I've got. And so something to look forward to for next week. If you're in the playoffs next week or this week and you think you're going to win or you're anticipating a win, I mentioned before, the New Orleans Saints, if they are out there, they're not, they're not a very highly ranked team, but look for the New Orleans Saints in your free agency area for next week. They are going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. You could plug them in. They do well enough. Again, I'm not sure they put up 95 points so far this week. They're only rostered in about 40% of all fantasy football leagues. They've got an easy matchup there against Las Vegas. Look for that one. That one might help you win your championship. So That's all I've got for fantasy. Let's check out another area here to see if we've got some more questions somewhere. Just bear with me for a minute because it is not even 11:30 yet. So I want to stay on here for about 20 more minutes. We'll see if we can answer some more questions. Questions. All right, just some more information. Guerrero is out. David Montgomery, we knew about him, was out. Alec Pierce is out due to concussion. Xavier Legette is out. Trey Benson is out. Antoine Winfield Jr. is out with a knee. Jalen Waddle, there was a question. He's doubtful now with his bad knee. Cade Otton is doubtful with his bad knee. Questionables that we mentioned before: Tyreek Hill, Tyrone Tracy, Tony Pollard, Njoku. There's a long list of guys that are questionable for this week. So make sure that you're checking your individuals in there. And let's see if we can get some more questions. Not seeing anything. A little bit more of an awkward time to do a show about fantasy, but hey, this is what happens during this time of year. We've got some Saturday games. And two very good games today with a lot of playoff implication and a lot of good players on each one of those teams. Give me just a minute. We're going to scroll through and see if I've got some questions on any of my other sites here. You know what? It doesn't look like it. So a lot of people have probably been bounced from fantasy, which is really too bad. Yeah. All right. Well, if that is it from everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. If you make your playoffs, please let me know. Follow along here down at the bottom. Follow, subscribe, share. Usually don't post when I'm going to be on. Sometimes I do a show with other individuals and I'm waiting for them to kind of come on board. But go ahead. If you follow me here on X or on YouTube, you'll get the notifications right away of when we'll be popping in shows. Otherwise, if you've got questions, hit me up on X and let me know if you've got some questions there. I will generally have a relatively quick turnaround time. And that is about it. Yeah, no questions. That's a bummer. Okay. Well, good luck, everybody, in your fantasy football playoffs. Like I said before, if you want to, hit me up, follow me, all that fun stuff. And we'll go from there. Oh, and as a last bit, I am going to say this as well. If you're interested, if you do what I do, or if you're big into fantasy football, if you have your own company, if it's, Fantasy Life or Fantasy Careers or Fantasy this, Fantasy that, hit me up. Next year, I'd like to put together a league of just fantasy businesses, or fantasy professionals, fantasy aficionados, whatever you want to call yourself. Hit me up and we'll go from there. So thanks for watching, everyone. Good luck, and tune in.